disease. You're just in a competitive environment and you are losing.
A man has to have tenacity and go through struggles and days where you're like, I can't do this anymore, but still pop your head up the next day and be like, all right, let me go get back in the gym.
If you're truly heartbroken, you can't sleep. That means you're going to get in fantastic shape. You better hit the gym. You have nothing else to do. Heartbreak's a fantastic motivator, as is depression, as is sadness. Great. If you were jacked, she probably wouldn't have left your ass. So get your shit together.
The body positivity movement started with women challenging society's expectations of the ideal female body. Did it work? Or a decade in, have we just got to the stage where men are equally as miserable? And while for them it's less about being petite, slim and delicate and more about muscles, capability and strength, it's having a similar impact.
Men don't feel great about their bodies, and lots of men are unhappy about the ways that their bodies look.
Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, the increasing pressure on young men to look a certain way. In recent years, there's been growing concern that people sharing tips on how to be masculine are taking it too far, promoting a message which is harmful, unrealistic, and potentially dangerous. But there don't seem to be many alternatives to challenge this damaging narrative. When I asked Chris Taylor, who is a doctor of psychology at the University of Auckland, why the body positivity movement has left men behind, he says it's because initially they didn't really need it.
One of the first things I think that we need to understand is that the foundation of the body positivity movement is a reaction to, on the one hand, a sexualization and objectification of many women in media and women on the street as well, and then also a sort of invisibilization of women who don't fit into that particular mode or model, or else an active disgust of those kinds of bodies. And so the body positivity movement for women, as I understand it, is born out of a reclamation or an attempt to try to find a space between those two positions. For men, that dynamic is very different. Men's bodies historically have not been sexualized to the same degree, and if they are sexualized, it's done very differently.
Could you elaborate on that?
It's very different in the sense that men have been represented as active participants in their sexualization. So we can think of like Daniel Craig in the 007 films, or basically any of the Hollywood action heroes. The sexualization of their bodies, their muscularity and so on is not a gazing upon them in a passive way. It is an ownership of their sexuality. Whereas men who don't fit into that model have tended not to have the same level of disgust or dismissal. So we can think of larger men as often represented as being funny, or sometimes being seen as dopey in media. We can think of the Homer Simpsons. There isn't that same level of disgust. There isn't that same level of repulsion that women who are larger face as a sort of social backlash. And so I think it's important when we're thinking about where men sit in relation to this body positivity movement, that we understand it has this long tail, this long historic cultural and social bedrock that makes the relationships and the ways that we look at men and women in media quite different. And so that is part and parcel of why men don't fit so well into this body positivity movement, because to a degree, men haven't really needed it as much. I think that that's an important piece of groundwork, because I think when we talk about men and representations of men and the struggles that men face around their bodies, it can be easy to just focus on men without also saying, well, women have been dealing with this since media was invented and before.
Is it almost like the body positivity movement made the male population more aware?
I should say that men don't feel great about their bodies. There's research that goes back to the late 1990s and early 2000s about men's self-perception of their bodies, and lots of men are unhappy about the ways that their bodies look. It's different to the way that women experience those things. And again, to put it in broader context, we have to understand that the ways that bodies, idealized men's bodies, are understood is through things like muscularity, capability, strength, largeness, and that sort of thing. So in a way, you can recoup an idea of being bigger through an idea of strength or taking up space or that kind of thing. And so it's not to say that men all feel great about their bodies, because lots of men have insecurities about those. They often don't have room to talk about those things because it's seen as either being vain or arrogant.
So this ideal body type that's emerging, what does it look like?
Well, there have been changes over the last, let's say, 20 years in terms of how men's bodies look. I say 20 years, but I'm showing my age. I should say probably 30 years or even longer, because we can look to the 1990s and the early 2000s and we can see a form of male body that was more diverse. Pierce Brosnan in GoldenEye.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Had a hairy chest, which is something that you won't see in mainstream films anymore. You look at Harrison Ford in the early Indiana Jones films, and he's not jacked. He's lean, but he's not hugely muscled. And we can compare that to the more recent representations of men's bodies in films like, I think of Hugh Jackman as a really good example in the Wolverine movies, where he is so lean, he's so ripped.
He is a huge, jacked man. How huge? For his upcoming 10th appearance as Logan in Deadpool 3, Hugh Jackman claims to be eating over 8,000 calories a day. In addition, he's also hitting 2 grueling workouts a day in an effort to take Weapon X to the next level.
To a point that is unsustainable, as many men who have been through this process describe. You have to diet to a level that is very difficult and not sustainable if you want to maintain a sense of mental health. And so it has changed. And then, of course, we have the online environment and particularly the algorithmic recommendation to young men is often around things like how to build muscle, how to bench press, and so on, working out. And so I think that maybe the pressures are the same, but it's just been ramped up a little bit in the last couple of years. Because I remember when I was a teenager being interested in going to the gym and those sorts of things, but my access to information about how to do that was very limited. Whereas now you can pull out your phone and you can have a man who looks the way that you want to look, telling you how to look the way that he does. And so that's quite a different dynamic. I guess my main concern is I don't want to suggest that this is some brand new phenomenon that's come out of nowhere. We have to understand this within the context of long-standing understandings of masculinity.
I think it's something, that, like you say, has always been there, but it's becoming perhaps more normalised to talk about it. I know Jonah Hill has, publicly spoken about always having so much attention drawn to his weight.
Yes, Jonah Hill is a funny example because I don't know if you remember a few years ago, a series of quite controlling and misogynistic texts that he had sent to his ex-girlfriend were exposed, which suggested a level of insecurity.
The professional surfer and model who dated Hill from 2021 to 2022 posted a series of text messages allegedly sent from him, which detail, quote, boundaries for a romantic partnership. These include not surfing with men, posting pictures to social media of herself in a bathing suit, and cutting off friendships with certain men and, quote, women who are in unstable places.
Which happened to coincide with also him losing quite a lot of weight. So I don't know. Jonah Hill is a funny example. I mean, not a funny example, but...
That's interesting because that segues into this connection of the ideal body type with toxic masculinity. There's this growing trend on particularly social media on the manosphere of if you look a certain way and you act a certain way and you go to the gym and you get these big muscles, you can have any woman you want. You will get a girlfriend. And when that doesn't happen, it's the women that are the problem. I've done everything right. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on that. The first is that I know some listeners and people that I speak to get quite defensive when they hear the term toxic masculinity. It's a term that I tend not to use because it puts men on the defensive, and I think it has some use, but it's one of those terms that I like to clarify and say when we're talking about what we might describe as toxic masculinity, we're talking about behaviours, attitudes and postures that don't serve men or anybody else particularly well. When you speak to men about this, they can identify those traits. Whereas if you just say toxic masculinity, they go, oh, you mean all masculinity is toxic and,
right.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
And so I think it's important that we say, okay, when we're talking about the downside of masculinity, many men can identify what that looks like, whether it's the pressures to not show emotion, whether it's issues with how you communicate with the people that you know, whether it's struggles to open up, whether it's pressure to be hard, using violence to solve problems and so on. I think we can all agree that in most circumstances, those behaviours are not particularly helpful when taken to their extreme. The second thing, the manosphere is a sort of loose confederacy of different groups that go from online influencers, and some of your listeners might have heard of Andrew Tate.
It doesn't matter if it's getting a girl or it's making money or it's getting status. It doesn't matter what it is. As a man, we live in hyper-competitive environments. I don't think enough men understand how competitive the world is. If you want a girl, you're competing against other men. You're not the only man who had the idea of getting that girl. You have to be as successful as possible in all realms. You have to be as good-looking, as funny, as smart, as spontaneous, as interesting, as charismatic, as rich as possible. You need to try very hard to be your absolute best. And as you become a better man, you'll crack through different tiers of attractiveness, and eventually you get to the top and you'll be able to have any girl you want.
Listeners might also be familiar with the incel movement. That's part of the manosphere, arguably. And so the manosphere is a sort of loose collection of men who are all unified by a philosophy, which we can describe as the red pill, which is premised on a rejection of feminism. To the question of how that idealized body works, and particularly a sense of entitlement, perhaps. And in particular, in this circumstance, we're talking about heterosexual relationships between boys and girls, in my example, because I've been working with boys in high schools. One young man described exactly this. He was describing what women want, what girls want, what they find attractive. And he was saying, okay, I go to the gym because I need to get big and strong, and I need to lose fat so that I'm super lean, and I need to present myself in a particular way, and therefore, because that's what women want, then I will get a girlfriend. And I have two major concerns about this way of thinking, particularly for young men. The first is, I think, that it sets up a dynamic which says that I've ticked all of these boxes, and if I don't get a girlfriend, therefore there's something wrong with women. Not me, because I've done everything correctly. And that can lead to quite dangerous places, as kind of this idea that women have been ruined by feminism and they don't want a real man and all of this other kind of thing. But at a sort of larger level, and one that I find quite sad, is that in this boy's account of what women find attractive, he didn't talk about anything like sense of humour, communication, having interests, hobbies, anything that arguably make out a well-rounded individual who would be attractive to a potential partner. I just find it very concerning that this idea that you work out, you sort of take on the posture and the attitude of these online influencers will get you a girlfriend, but it doesn't include anything else. It forces you, in fact, to push down elements of yourself that kind of make you you. And I think that that's very detrimental to young men, to think that they need to fit into this very tight box.
You've spoken a lot about incels, and I think it could just be worth clarifying that for our listeners.
Again, this whole worldview, the incel worldview, is set up on an idea of a kind of idealized masculinity and an idealized femininity that doesn't really exist in the real world. It's an online movement of predominantly, almost exclusively men who are involuntary celibate, in the sense that they would like to have a partner and they would like to be having sex, but they don't have the opportunity because of a series of often self-perceived limits. So I'm a little bit cautious about using the term incels, because over the last couple of years there has been a tendency to describe all misogynistic groups on the internet as incels, which is not only all of the misogynistic groups online not incels, but also not all incels are misogynistic. And a large part of that is because a lot of the mass shootings and mass attacks in the US over the last 10 years that have been arising from the online space have been drawn from this extreme end of the incel movement, what we would call the black pill. If you've heard of the red pill, then the black pill is the sort of extremist end of this, which is totally nihilistic and self-destructive. So incels as a group are relatively small, and in terms of the broader landscape of online communities, they don't make up a large part of it. And to a degree, they sit apart from the manosphere in some sense, because they are quite critical of the red pill and quite critical of pick-up artist communities and so on.
I would almost argue that, from the female perspective, that women don't want necessarily, let's just, for lack of better phrasing, a gym rat who all they care about is how they look. Andrew Tate has been called out a lot on social media, particularly from females, about what he's promoting. So this idealized body image, how is it that it's gained so much momentum?
There are two things. One is that there's this idea that to become a fully realized man, you have to get a girlfriend and it has to be a particular dynamic and the relationship should look like this and therefore you'll be a man. And I like to put myself in these examples because I was a young man once, and so I'm not kind of speaking from experience, but young men feel very anxious about how to become a man and how to be a successful person and how to communicate with other people and how to be popular. And those sorts of insecurities are not easily spoken by young men. There's not a lot of avenues to talk about your worries or your concerns. And so when you get a message from some guy on the internet that says, all you need to do is get a bigger chest, then it helps to solve a lot of those problems because you can channel all of those anxieties into saying, okay, well, I may not have a girlfriend now and I might not be popular now, but if I get a big chest, then maybe those things will happen. And so I think that that's the appeal. It's a way to assuage a sense of anxiety for young men that they need to do these things. This kind of extreme dieting, going to the gym for hours on end, not only does it interfere with your relationships and your kind of attitude to the world and your wallet because it's expensive, but also I think that, it sort of closes down avenues to explore mental health alternatives or anxiety-reducing alternatives that aren't based within your body. So, I mean, I do watercolor painting at home, and that's sometimes scoffed at as being not very masculine, and that's fine. I laugh it off because I think it's just so silly that you can't be a man and be interested in painting. Being a man is supposed to be being able to do whatever you want, right? But not that. I do worry that this focus on the body and then this kind of larger narrative of we use it for stress relief or mental health support. The other things that you can do for stress relief or mental health support are talking with your friends, going for a walk in the bush. I mean, these sound kind of airy, fairy things, but I do worry that the idea of the gym slots so well into a masculine idea.
Yeah, I was going to say that it reinforces to be a man means to not show feelings, right? So
and to be strong.
Yeah, you go to the gym and you lift some weights. You don't sit with your mates and unload that you're actually feeling not great.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we look at the coping mechanisms that are available to men, and particularly men that buy into a very stereotyped idea of masculinity, they are drinking alcohol, working out to the extreme, or sex and pornography. But there's a whole range of different behaviors that we can engage in that can help with mental health, can help to de-stress or just make our lives richer. I am concerned for men that if you get too stuck in this box of what it means to be a man, you close down other avenues for adventure and other avenues for exploration. The very things that make living worthwhile, you might find that you have hobbies or interests that you never would have thought of. If you can just loosen this boundary around what you think being a proper man is supposed to be. I'm concerned that young men are being fed a very specific, tight and narrow image of masculinity, and that if they subscribe too strongly to that, that it's going to set them up for not a particularly happy or fulfilling life or relationships that are fulfilling and rewarding for everybody involved.
And there's also concern particularly on how TikTok is sparking eating disorders and bigorexia among young teenage boys. And eating disorders are another topic that has historically been considered a feminine problem. But, men actually struggle from them as well.
I mean, masculinity is about self-control at its most kind of stereotyped version. And so the ultimate sense of self-control is controlling how you move your body and how, growing it and limiting and controlling the intake of your food. It's the most foundational and most basic sense of self-control. And so you can easily see how that slides into dangerous territory if not checked, because if you're just boiling chicken breast and eating raw broccoli and going to the gym for 6 hours a day, not only is that detrimental to your body in the long term, but as I said before, what does it do to your relationships? TikTok is fascinating because the way the algorithm works is, the more that you watch a particular video, the more that you will be recommended videos with that theme. There's been recent research that came out just a couple of months ago from Debbie Gang. It basically tracks a series of profiles of young men that they create, fake profiles, and they see what is recommended to them. And over a very short period of time, what is being recommended to them is anti-feminist, misogynistic gym content and that sort of thing. And so TikTok in particular profiles boys to feed them what is expected that they will like. But what is interesting to me is, having spoken to lots of young men about their experiences of the internet, young men are very frustrated with that because it simplifies their idea about what being a young man is supposed to be like. But also, they don't always want to see that, or misogynistic content might make them feel very uncomfortable and they might not know how to deal with that. I'm also wary that I don't want to suggest that young people are sort of just easily brainwashed by this thing, that they do have a lens, because I don't want to be one of those adults in the room who says, the internet's rotting your brain. Then I would have said, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because having social media is not actually that popular among my guy friends. Yeah. Like, a lot of them are like, oh, no, don't have the time for that. How do we change things from here?
I think that there's a tendency, particularly amongst adults, to simplify the issue and say, point to Andrew Tate and say, if we just ban Andrew Tate, then we will get rid of all of these problems. Andrew Tate is just one figure in a larger landscape of misogynistic figures and influences on the internet. And once we get rid of Andrew Tate, there will just be other figures that will take his place. And there are already those figures online. So I think the first thing that we need to do is not simplify, and we need to understand that this is a much larger and sophisticated operation. But the second thing is, we need to meet boys and young men and even grown men where they are and start at that point of what is appealing about those messages to you, and, what do you get from this that you don't get elsewhere? And I say this because I've worked in schools with young men, and they're very responsive and very critical and very sensitive, and they say the most amazing things once they know that you're going to listen to them and you're not going to jump down their throat the minute they say that they've watched Andrew Tate content or whatever it is. They're trying to figure out how to be a grown-up. They're trying to figure out how to become a man and what that's supposed to look like. But they have limited resources to do that. They have limited role models. They don't have a lot of variety and ideas about what a man looks like. And so I think, 1, meet boys where they're at. 2, engage them in a way that doesn't accuse them. And 3 is to offer them other possibilities. We need to make sure that we offer men, young men and boys, alternative ways to understand what it means to be a man that are less constricted by societal stereotypes and ideals about masculinity, which rely on very old school and quite outdated ideas. Boys have emotions, they are human beings, and they want to be able to express them. The boys I talk to are very frustrated at the idea that they're not allowed to cry or that they can't talk to their friends. They're very sad. And so I think that it's really important that we try to model, or at least promote, more diverse ways of being a man, more diverse ways of being a person, really, because to a degree, being a man and all of that sort of stuff carries with it so much baggage. And for myself, I feel a great sense of relief not having to subscribe to those things anymore. It's allowed me a more fulfilling life, such a more fulfilling outlook on the world, to just give up a lot of those expectations about how I'm supposed to behave.
That's all from us here at The Detail this week. Thanks to Chris Taylor, and thank you for joining us. The Detail is funded by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell. I'm Davina Zimmer. Ka kite anō.